we come to find out that we were not in the right place. We had crashed this funeral.
Oh no.
Yeah, it was just like a regular funeral that was happening at the same time in the
Oh
same
wow.
place or something. And then because we were so uncomfortable, we just started uncontrollably laughing.
Welcome to the Eat Your Content podcast. I'm your host, Rich Herrera. This is your pod for all things food and pop culture. Thank you for tuning in. Just a reminder to follow me on socials at Rich Herrera and at Eat Your Content. Anywhere you get your socials. I'm on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook and Twitter. Hopefully TikTok for another month or so. I don't know. We'll kind of see how that goes here in the U.S. Some programming reminders. Got big things planned for January, so you want to stay tuned and make sure you like and follow and subscribe wherever you get your podcast so that you know where, what things drop and where to go to find it. So for today's episode, I'm so happy to have Katie Johnson. Katie Johnson is a host of the Tasty Trails Travel Pod, where she tells stories, I'm sure, from her well-worn passport and fun stories from every stamp that makes it in there. So Katie Johnson, I want to thank you for coming on the pod and taking the time to be with me this morning.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, so you kind of came up on Facebook and we were talking about what you do and your podcast a little bit. But before we dive into your podcast, tell me a little bit about yourself. I love to hearing people's origin stories and what they do and where they came from and how they got to be where we're sitting on the podcast today. So tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what you do and how you got to be where you are.
Yeah, so I am from the Chicago area, a little bit outside Chicago, but I've been privileged enough to be able to travel kind of throughout my life. I studied abroad, and that's where I was really able to dive in and kind of be somewhere for a long time. And I've just kind of always been curious about the world. And yeah, like 10 years ago, I made the decision to leave the US, and I've been living abroad ever since. So I've just been kind of bouncing around a mix of kind of odd jobs here and there, living in different countries, continents, all that stuff, and also backpacking, digital nomading, just kind of a mix of a bunch of stuff. And, through that, I found a lot of, I found food has been, I've always been interested in food, but exploring cultures, it was like the easiest way kind of in the door was through the food. A great way to talk to people, to meet people, and to really get to know a country. And so kind of through that, I really was able to explore deeper into countries and cultures and communities and stuff. And it's also just really delicious and fun.
Yeah.
And so kind of through that, it all just kind of like came to be. And so, yeah, now I decided to start a podcast on food and getting to actually just focus on talking about that. And it's been a ton of fun.
Yeah, I always find it interesting that the best way to understand a particular culture is through the food. I think that's a great equalizer when you sit down at a table and you're experiencing the culture through the food and you hear the stories behind the food, right? So you think you know something, you think you know some place, and then you eat their food and you learn something entirely new about that. So you're saying that the travels inspired the podcast. What was kind of the catalyst for that? What made you were traveling, I'm sure, for a while, and then the podcast came about. What was the catalyst that made you know what? I think there's some stories here that I want to tell.
So I'd originally started a podcast on digital nomading and just kind of, especially because it became a big trend post pandemic, and a lot of people had the opportunity to do that, and it was just me kind of ruminations, and a lot of people talk about the great part about traveling and being on the road and stuff, but there's also a lot of like hard parts about it. And so I started off kind of talking about that, and then I got I've been doing it for so long, like 7 years at that point. And so I got kind of tired and wanted to settle down. And I was like, oh, I don't think I can talk about this anymore because I'm not going to do it anymore. And I was like, okay, but now what is something that is sustainable that I can just really, that I love talking about and, won't ever run out of content. And I was like, oh my God, the mix of food and travel together and being able to expose people who might not otherwise talk, like I do, of course, talk about the delicious food, Italy and France and stuff, the stuff that everybody talks about. They're very famous for their cuisine. But I also, want to highlight Native Americans or these smaller groups of people that don't get their food or culture talked about probably enough. And so it's been really fun for me to learn, but also it's been great. I've had, great response of people like, oh my gosh, like I had no idea that this like group of people existed, or, and really getting exposure to different groups of people around the world. And I think kind of the biggest thing has been discovering like, while we're all very different and come from different cultures and have different beliefs and stuff, at the end of the day, we're also really the same. And we want to be with like friends and family, have connection, have good food. And no matter what that good food looks like to us, that's the stuff that like brings us comfort. And so, yeah, kind of talking about that just every day in my life, I realized like, oh, it's starting to like focus on that and actually like highlight that for other people to see as well. Yeah, just kind of, it all just kind of came together.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how a podcast episode for Tasty Trails comes together. Do you find a place that you want to explore and make it purposeful to go there and make a podcast episode about it, or does the inspiration come when you just happen to be in a place? Like how much planning goes into an episode in terms of the culture you want to highlight, the food you want to highlight, or the guest you want to bring on?
So it kind of depends. There's a little bit of all of those. Sometimes it is just something, sometimes it's something that I just come across. I'm like, oh, this is interesting and I would love to learn more and reach out to somebody to talk about it. Sometimes it's something that I am passionate about. For example, Italy is kind of my everything. And so I'm doing a very deep dive into kind of all the different regions of Italy, and an episode on kind of each region as opposed to Italy as a whole. Um, and sometimes it's, yeah, people that I come across, so it is kind of all very different, but that's also what's fun about it. So not every episode is exactly the same, and there's so many different angles of food as well that you can go at. And so yeah, it's kind of about not trying to force it all into a type, and just kind of going with it, what comes to me, and what I see, and really learning from that. And as I go, like I have one episode where there's a chef, who mentioned her friend and like this other type of cuisine that she does. And I was like, oh, that would be a great episode. I'd love to talk more about that. And so she connected us. And so, yeah, it's just been crazy, the kind of network of people around the world. And, kind of one thing, sort of like travel as well. Like you start traveling and you say like, oh, cool. Like I've seen the Eiffel Tower. And while you're at the Eiffel Tower, someone's like, oh my gosh, but have you been to like this city or like this thing? We just did this. And you're like, oh no, now I have to add another another thing. And in a great way, it just kind of keeps expanding. And so, yeah, I guess that's not a great answer because it's a little bit of everything, but it really
Yeah.
is just kind of, yeah, kind of from everywhere.
No, that's great because with travel, I'm imagining is a lot of going with the flow. There's so many things that can happen that are unplanned. You miss a flight, you miss a boat, you miss a train, something. Has there ever been a moment when you traveled that something unexpected like that happened, but turned out to be like a really great story for a podcast?
Um, Luckily, I guess, knock on wood, I haven't missed a flight yet. Um, but I mean, yeah, my favorite part of travel is just the kind of random encounters that happen. I was doing a walking tour in St. Petersburg one day, and I heard my plan was to go to Russia and take the Trans-Siberian across the country. And which is a train that traverses like all of Russia, or you can take it down into Mongolia and then into China. And so I had no plans, just kind of showed up in Russia, and I heard this girl talking, and she was like, "Oh yeah, I'm like kind of planning to do this thing," and I was like, "Oh, I'm doing that too," and I just like inserted myself in the conversation. It's like, "Hello, I'm Katie. I heard you're doing this. Like, do you want to like do that together?" And she's like, "Oh, that'd be great." And so she's from Germany, and there was a certain city that we got to, and she just heard these people speaking German. She's like, oh my gosh, like, can I please go talk to them? I haven't spoken German in so long and my brain hurts. And I was like, yes, of course, go talk to them. And so she just kind of goes up and talks to them because she just hadn't spoken her own language in a long time. And she comes back and she's like, hey, like these women are on our train ride. And we all kind of get to talking the next day, and one of the women um, was in Russia because her great aunt, who she'd never met before, was living in the next town that we were in the next city that we were going to, and she had invited them all to. So it's Yekaterinburg, which is the city where the Romanov, like the Tsar family, like the Romanovs, like
Hmm.
Anastasia, people are familiar with that,
Yeah.
were all assassinated.
Oh,
And
wow.
so it was going to be like the 99th anniversary of the Romanov assassination, and there's going to be like a ceremony. And so she invited us to go, and I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, that would be like this really cool thing to do. So we we show up at the church, and because it's a Russian Orthodox church, so you have to the women have to cover their heads, and then you have to wear a scarf, or sorry, a skirt. And if you don't do that, they like provide you with it. So we kind of all looked a little bit silly in our mismatched, headscarves and skirts. And we, kind of push our way to the front because we want to get in there, and everyone's just like crying, and we're like, oh my goodness, like they're very into this. But it's all in Russian, and we don't speak Russian. And we come to find out that we were not in the right place. We had crashed this funeral.
Oh,
Um,
no.
yeah, it was just like a regular funeral that was happening at the same time in the
Oh,
same place
wow.
or something. And then because we were so uncomfortable, we just started uncontrollably laughing,
Oh, no.
which was even worse. So we get the heck out of there, and finally make it to meeting this great aunt. And I was like, oh my gosh, she like told us the wrong place, or I don't know. And this very old woman is wheeled up to us, and she's lovely. Um, and it turns out that so she's Austrian, but she was worried that her mind was going to go when she turned 40. So she's like, oh, I got to keep my mind active. Like, I'm going to start learning Russian. So she started learning Russian, and she'd done a lot of work with the church. So she uh, went to Chernobyl when the explosion happened, and so had some radiation poisoning and kind of different things because of all of that. And she had done such great work with the church that the Russian and spoke Russian, that the Russian archbishop invited her to like live with him. And it turns out we were at the Russian archbishop's house, and we're having
Wow.
breakfast like
Oh.
in his honor. And I was like, oh, okay, I did not dress appropriately for this. And then we had like breakfast at his house, like, and then a private tour of the museum, which is like attached to his house. So it was the Romanov Museum, and we get to like this one room, and they're like this beautiful grand piano, and you're like, and they said, oh, this is the Romanov pianos, like the Tsar's piano of hundreds of years. And they're like, does anybody play the piano? And I was like,
Oh,
oh,
wow.
well, I play the piano. And like, do you want to play it? And I was like, what? And they're like, yeah, you can play it if you want. And so I sat down and I played the Romanov piano.
Wow.
Like, yeah, it was crazy. And yeah, it was just wild. And so it was just because I like inserted myself into a conversation. I was like, hello, can I invite myself to hang out with you? And kind of one thing leads to the other. And yeah, it was just, it was insane.
Well, that went better than expected.
That's crazy. Talk about failing successfully, right? Just kind of
Yeah,
tripping up on
yeah,
all these like what could have been a series of misfortunate events turned into this remarkable end story of you playing on a centuries old piano. Like in what in what crazy wildest dreams would have ever happened to you, right?
yeah.
That is a wild story. That's awesome. So a lot of my podcasts here on Eat Your Content talks about pop culture and food on TV, things like that. Have movies and TV shows about food have grown in popularity, travel food shows, things like that. And a lot of people get inspired by those shows to go travel. Like Eat, Pray, Love, I think is the best example of that type of movie that inspired a whole lot of people to go and visit a place, just based on the food that is offered in that area. Have there been any trips for you that were inspired by maybe a food show or a movie or a travel show that you saw and you're like, oh, wait, yeah, I haven't been there yet. I need to go check that out.
Um, Certainly, I'm not sure. Well, I'm obsessed with Napolitana pizza. And so Naples is kind of my mecca of everything. And so I did actually go to the pizzeria that they go to in Eat, Pray, Love. But going to like find those ingredients there was a huge food dream. And so like Stanley Tucci has a great program on
Hmm.
Italy. And
Yeah.
so kind of, yeah, because there's experiences that you have on or that they have on TV shows that generally the average person doesn't quite get to have. But I do kind of love watching those shows and trying to imitate just like as much as I can. Like, okay, I want to try to find that restaurant or anything that I actually haven't seen a ton of Anthony Bourdain stuff, but I do love to, he always has such great suggestions
Hmm.
that whenever I'm in a city, I always look up like where he has gone. So I guess I maybe do it in reverse is where I find I kind of go where I either am nearby or I kind of want to go and then backtrack and then do my research on the city by watching either Netflix shows or programs like that to kind of see like, oh, where's the best place that I can go when I'm there.
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of these food shows and travel shows highlight some of the big hitters in food tourism. You got Italy, like you spoke about Italy a lot, Paris, London, and those types of places. Is there an underrated food destination that you would recommend people to go that's maybe not in the brochures, that's a little bit off the beaten path a little bit in your travels? What is some of those underrated places that you would suggest people try?
I love the food in Turkey. Um, it's very similar to Greek food. Kind of that whole region has a lot of similar food. Um, but yeah, I love Turkish food. A lot of so like the meze platters, there's going to be a lot of dips. So you got like your hummuses and baba ganoush and stuff. But it's also just it's so fresh and delicious. I'm a vegetarian as well, and that a little bit eliminates some stuff that I can eat. So I live in Argentina, for example, and it's so famous for all the meat and stuff, which
Yeah.
I don't partake in. And a lot of people are very personally offended by that here.
Big beef
Um,
country, that area.
yeah. So yeah, I guess I can kind of mostly only speak as far as vegetarian food goes, but yeah,
Sure.
definitely Turkey. I mean, they also have, I'm sure people have had kebab in many different countries that they go to. So just think about that, but like, from where it comes from. And yeah, everything is just so fresh and delicious, and it just all comes with such a history. You can like feel it. I don't know, like when you're there. And so yeah, that part of the world, just kind of the Mediterranean food, which I guess Mediterranean isn't underrated, but I think people think about less as Turkey than they do Greece and stuff.
Yeah, I think Greece gets the lion's share. When you say Mediterranean, people think Greek.
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think Turkey doesn't get the play that it deserves in the Mediterranean, in the broad sense of Mediterranean food. And yeah, so that's great. Yeah, Turkey's a great spot to get some Middle Eastern Mediterranean food. And you kind of, where Turkey's situated, you kind of get that mix, right? Of just not just
Totally.
Greek style Mediterranean food, but some other regions in the Middle East and things like that. That's awesome.
Absolutely.
So me and you are completely opposite in terms of travel. I have not traveled outside of the U.S. a whole lot, unfortunately. Not that I don't want to, but sometimes people don't have the means or the opportunity to do so. What are some ways that you would suggest that, the United States, huge country, melting pot of cultures. How can we, as Americans that don't have the opportunity to travel, how can we experience other cultures? What are your suggestions on being able to experience other cultures as if we were traveling to other countries here in the U.S.?
So, I mean, just like you were saying, that it is such a melting pot of cultures and communities. And so, even just like looking out in your hometown, kind of many cities have a big population of one or two different groups of immigrants that have come. And so, what is that group for you? Because certainly there's going to be either like markets where they have some of the food, they put on events. Like there's actually been a ton of Russians coming to Argentina, and so now there's a huge like Russian market where you can go and find Russian food and ingredients and stuff like that. And so, yeah, what's the community? What are the big immigrant communities in your city, and how can you connect with them? Because not only that, you can hear like their stories, you can help support them as well. Uh, and so I think that's a great place to start. Otherwise, for sure, your closest big city is definitely going to have some great variety as well. And again, that varies throughout the country. For example, in Chicago, there's a massive Polish population, and so you're going to find some excellent Polish food. And so, yeah, just kind of doing a little research about who is in your area. And sometimes I think a lot of it has to do with the geography and how similar it is to sometimes the geography in their home country. Uh, and so, yeah, that is the great thing about the U.S. is that you can do so much traveling with while staying in the country.
Yeah, yeah. You kind of think about Epcot, right, at Disney, and the walk around the world kind
Yeah,
of thing. And I will say, it's a theme park, but it's got some pretty unique takes on the world cuisine in that area, as close as it can be without leaving Florida. So that's good advice. Yeah, local farmers markets I think are great. Asian markets I think are a great place to start too, to be able to find other foods that maybe you aren't used to eating or haven't eaten before, but a way to be able to experience another culture without leaving your backyard. So for those that do travel, like as Americans, we have kind of this horrible reputation when we go overseas. Like you can point out an American at 100 yards, right? I mean, even when traveling in the U.S., when you go to New York, you can always tell who's a native New Yorker and who's not just by the way they kind of act and are. What can we do as Americans traveling overseas to not be that guy, quote unquote, that guy, to be able to respect a culture and do responsible tourism and not kind of be that, Americans as we're known for kind of being loud, brash, and overly friendly, I think, in some cases. So what can we do to, not that I want to downplay that as a person, but what can we do to kind of maybe keep ourselves in check as we go to another place that we haven't been to before and make a good impression as a tourist?
yeah. So I think the biggest thing is to be open-minded, and just be really careful about the language that you use. So instead of saying, like, I think the biggest thing that I see is people say the word weird a lot, and it might be weird to you, but really it's just different. Like it's not weird at all to the people who live there and are from that culture. And so instead of using the word weird and try making that face or the smells or whatever, try to keep those kinds of faces maybe to yourself a little bit, and use the word like, oh, this is interesting, or this is different, or like I've never seen this before, instead of like, oh my gosh, this is so weird. Because that can come off as offensive, and again, it isn't weird, it's just weird to you. And
Right.
so being really careful about that, and just be open-minded. Like it's okay to not like everything, like there are a lot of different tastes and foods and smells and textures and stuff, and people from other countries aren't going to always love the stuff that we love so much. And so that's okay. You don't have to go there and fake it or anything. But just keep an open mind and also balance it out. So, like if you're feeling like, okay, I've had so much of this kind of food today, it's okay to like go to dinner and take a break at, go grab a Starbucks or something, or go if you need to go to McDonald's or have the hotel breakfast. That's like a Western breakfast. That's okay too. Like, don't feel like you have to 100%, because then you can enjoy it when you're out having the authentic meal for lunch or dinner or something. So just be curious, be aware of how your actions are affecting other people. Doing a little research is also helpful. Like I found, like in China and Japan, they slurp their food, because it's a sign to the chef that they're really enjoying it. I did not know that when I first went there, and it was driving me crazy because, like, for us in our culture, to slurp is so rude. And so I was just sitting there, just like hearing people slurping, and I was like, oh gosh, like, I can't hear that noise. Why
Nails on a
is everyone
chalkboard, right?
doing that? Yeah. Oh gosh, it was really hard. And then I learned like culturally, like they're being really polite and telling the chef that they like it. And I was like, oh, and that like flipped a switch for me, and it wasn't annoying anymore. I like understood the reasoning behind it, and that totally helped me it not be so infuriating to
Yeah.
hear.
Yeah, yeah. I think those are great suggestions, especially like keeping an open mind and being mindful of when you're sitting at the table and eating food and you get something that looks strange to you, to just not make a face and not be like, and be like that. Um, and researching the culture before you go, I think is huge. Like if you know you're going to take an overseas trip, get on Google, man. Just and you have the wealth of the world's information in the palm of your hand. Do a little bit of research when you go. What are some like hand gestures that maybe you shouldn't do? What are some facial expressions that could be misconstrued in the wrong way? And there's this reality show that me and my wife watch. I don't know if you've heard of it, 90 Day Fiance. It's where
Yes.
Americans like, find love overseas and then they go there and they get off the plane and like, oh my gosh, it's so different. And I didn't know this. I'm like, you are trying to date somebody from that country. You couldn't take 5 seconds to do a download and look something up. Like, what is going on? It's so funny to watch that and watch them be those typical Americans in a foreign country and being like, oh man, they're not representative of us. Don't please have an opinion Americans that are based on that.
I know, right? I do feel a large responsibility when I like introduce myself and people ask where I'm from. I feel this massive responsibility to make sure that I'm representing the
Yeah.
country in a more accurate picture than kind of maybe what's portrayed on the news or whatever.
Right. You're like, we're not all that. So not all
Exactly.
hashtag not all Americans, right?
Yeah.
So I do want to ask a couple of quick lightning round, just quick question and answer and get your thoughts on some of these. If you could create an ultimate food or travel bucket list, what's one destination or experience that needs to be on that list?
Something that I haven't done, or you mean like for other people?
Either way, something that you haven't done, like your personal bucket list. That's good.
I still haven't been to India, and I think there's a lot of delicious food to be eaten in India.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So, of the places that you have visited, what dish or meal from your travels do you find yourself craving the most and why?
uh, Napolitana pizza, because I just love it
Yeah,
so much. It's so
it's
good.
yeah, it's such a different type of pizza, right? And in America you have all kinds, but Napolitanian pizza is so good. I like it that it's a little doughy in the middle. It's delicious.
It's so simple, and it's yeah, the the ingredients really have to shine because it is like so simple. And yeah, I could eat that every day. I went to Naples and I ate pizza literally every day there. So good.
And then you come back to the US like, oh man, we are really missing out. Uh,
Yeah.
have you ever gone on a trip and thought, okay, I'm going to expect this when I get there, and then you sit down and eat, and you're like, oh, this is not what I was expecting at all.
I suppose Mexican food. There's a lot of Mexican food that we think is like Tex-Mex, or that we think is Mexican. That's much more Tex-Mex, like a burrito, I suppose.
Yeah.
Like a Chipotle burrito, like a Mexican burrito is much skinnier. And I mean, even like the flour tortilla is very from colonialization and everything. So
Hmm.
yeah, I guess Mexican food. Not all Mexican food, but a lot of Mexican food has been either Tex-Mex slash just totally Americanized.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, I can understand that. Burritos, I'm sure in Mexico aren't like these huge, you know, football size things that you're going to be walking around with on the streets
Oh,
of
but they're so
Tijuana or
good.
whatever. They are good.
Yeah.
They are good. So I want to give you a few minutes here just to kind of plug your podcast. Where can people find you on socials? What kind of projects you have coming up? Any particular episodes we should be on the lookout for? Things like that.
Yeah, so my podcast is called Tasty Trails Travel Pod, a bit of a mouthful. But yeah, so I'm mostly active on Instagram. I do believe I have a Facebook, but yeah, definitely Instagram is the place to connect with me. And then you can find my podcast, Tasty Trails Travel Pod, um, on Spotify, Apple, anywhere you get your podcasts. But yeah, no, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. I love talking food and travel and everything. If you're going somewhere, happy to give people suggestions or kind of my favorite places if I know it. Yeah, I never get sick of talking about food and travel. And yeah, I've really been inspired by Chef Jose Andres. Like I love his World Central Kitchen mission. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Oh yeah.
He Yeah, so basically he's a first responder to all these different like types of disasters and things, and just gives people food and basic things. And I would love to be able to grow my podcast to start not something quite like that as first responder, but just to be able to give food to people, kind of always be on the ground in places and make sure that people have food and redistributing food. And it is so exciting and important to get to know cultures and stuff, but it is something that is a basic human right that we need to have to live our lives and to be productive humans. And if we don't have to worry about where that comes from, we can focus on other stuff like studying, doing a good job like at work, and things like that. And so I would love to be able to grow the podcast to have a huge reach around the world, to be able to start a network of an organization kind of similar to that, to be able to give food to people who need it. So that's kind of the ultimate goal with the podcast. But yeah, I'm kind of working on stuff for the upcoming year, and hoping to talk to, it's people from all over the world, especially again, kind of underserved communities. Definitely, we're going to be talking to someone from the Native American community in the United States, but also from all indigenous populations from all over the world as well, and also some fan favorites to kind of get to know that better and where you can find the most authentic versions of stuff. And so, yeah, lots of good stuff coming up.
Awesome. That sounds fantastic. So, folks, I highly suggest listening to Katie's podcast, Tasty Trails podcast. It's great, and they're bite-sized episodes, real, easy to listen to, and just really fun stories from a lot of people. I've listened to a few. I think it was episode 13. You had a Filipino on there. I'm Filipino, so I connected with that one. So that was really fun to listen to. And, no matter if you traveled a lot or if you traveled very little, you're going to find her podcast to be very fun to listen to and educational in many cases. So, Katie, thank you so much for coming on the pod. I appreciate your time so much, taking your time out on this day to be able to talk about food and travel with me.
No, thank you so much. This was so fun.
Yeah, excellent. So don't forget, guys, find me on social media at Rich Herrera, at Eat Your Content on all social channels. And don't forget to like and subscribe wherever you get your podcast and on YouTube to find out when new episodes are coming out. Katie, again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Eat Your Content. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting the podcast through my merch store on TeePublic. Get great quality items like t-shirts, hats, mugs, and more, all sporting the vibrant Eat Your Content logo. Go to teepublic.com/user/eatyourcontent for more great items, and thanks for your support.